Tēnā tātou katoa. We'll start with the karakia. Alex, if you could put the karaki. Thank you, karaki. E te whānau, whaia kia marama, kia whai take I roto I au mahi, katoa, kia tū, kia kaha, kia hora te marino, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou kia tātou katoa. Ki ngā manuhiri no mai haere mai. To our guests, warm welcome to you. Tēnā koutou katoa e tōtoko mai ana I tēnei kaupapa. And thank you everyone for supporting this initiative and cause. E mihi ana ki ngā tūtohu whenua o tēnei wahi. Recognize and acknowledge the cultural significant landmarks of this place, all the places that we're in. And ki te iwi kainga o tēnei whenua, tēnā koutou. And just want to acknowledge the local people of this land as well, in all the places we're in. So, ko Uni toku ingoa. Hi everyone, my name is Uni. I am one of the Common Grace Aotearoa team members, along with other people here, like Sylvia and Julian and Alex and JL. I don't think I missed anyone. Sorry if I have. So warmest of welcomes. Thank you for giving up your Tuesday evening to be with us today. So if you could go to thank you. The whakatoki to support our kōrero today is e hara taku toa I te toa takitahi, engari he toa takitini. Success should not be bestowed upon me alone. It's not individual success, but the success of a collective, and thought it was fitting because this kaupapa we're in really requires collective action and all of us banding together to do this thing. So if you could go to the agenda slide. This is the agenda for today. We are going to have an intro to the submission process and Don't Subsidize Pollution Guide by Alex, breakdown of the resources also by Alex, how it works in practice, getting people to submit in the moment by JL, and time for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to jot them down. You will have time to ask away. And just to say a little bit about Alex and JL, pronouns are he, him for both of them. Both bring a wealth of experience and skill. Alex is one of the co-directors of Common Grace Aotearoa and campaign organizer for the climate team. JL is a lawyer based in Wellington. Both have been involved in climate campaigns for many years. As JL says, he's lost count of the number of submissions he's written. So now I will pass over to Alex.
So thanks, Eunice. Kia ora koutou, great to have you with us tonight. So I'm going to speak to the submission process that we're engaging in collectively and talk through the resources that we've prepared. And I guess we're all coming from different contexts, but just noting that many of you, or most of you, will be coming from contexts that are where you might be looking to gather submissions in a church context. There also might be a few of you who are coming in and wanting to gather submissions in a community group that you're part of, or just in your flat or other contexts. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. The language I'll be using is largely kind of church-based language, but that can be applied to other contexts as well. So I'll go in with the frame that we're thinking about how to mobilize submissions in churches, but there's that doesn't limit the context that we can mobilize submissions in for this process. So just to kind of provide some context is that, this is something that Christians and churches, particularly the Anglican Church, has been speaking up on the issue of climate action for many years. These are some photos from submission mobilizing moments during the Zero Carbon Act process. And that also happened around the first emissions reduction plan a couple of years ago. So many of you might have been involved in gathering submissions then. And my colleague Kate was pivotal in organizing those submissions at the time. And here we are again for the second emissions reduction plan consultation, which covers the period from 2026 to 2030, the next 5 years of climate action that the government is planning to take and how they're going to meet our climate targets. So it's a really big plan that covers all sectors. But this campaign, that the Don't Subsidize Pollution campaign, is focusing on one of the areas within the broader plan of how we can tackle the issue of free carbon credits that subsidize, large industrial polluters. So just recognizing it's a broad plan that covers agriculture, transport, waste. It covers all sectors, and it's a when people have their say, they might want to speak to lots of different sectors that they feel passionate about. But this campaign has chosen a specific policy area to try and shift the lever on, because we think when we focus our energy collectively on some specific things, we can get more traction by really making a point and honing that and hitting it home with thousands of people saying the same thing. So that's why we're focusing our energy on these few key policy points. It's not to say that those other areas aren't important, but for the purpose of talking through the resources, that's what we've geared them towards. So it also is I guess the context for this having happened before gives us some tools and experience. So many of you might have run this before. John Luke's going to speak later on to his experience of running this previously with the Zero Carbon Act process and what that was like and how to try and actually get people to make a submission in the moment when you're doing this. So I'm going to start us with playing a 2-minute video that is kind of a summary of this opportunity, a summary of the campaign to end free carbon credits. And this is a video that you could show in your church or in your meeting where you're trying to gather submissions. But it just gives us a good 2-minute intro to the issue so that we're coming at it from a similar page. So I'll switch over to the video now.
What if the tools to protect our communities, homes and livelihoods from more Cyclone Gabriels, more Auckland floods and more wildfires in Canterbury were already in our kete, and we just had to call on the Minister of Climate Change to deploy them?
What if we could end our toxic relationship with fossil fuels and climate pollution and instead ensure good green jobs for local industries?
Take New Zealand Steel, one company that has a big footprint.
Last year, with co-funding from the government, they finally began preparations to switch from burning coal to an electric furnace to reduce emissions by 800,000 tonnes.
This one shift by just one company is the same as removing 300,000 petrol cars off the road forever. So if the technology is there, why aren't we seeing more of that big action from those big polluters?
Well, for 15 years, people in successive governments have been handing out free carbon credits to big, heavy industries like steel, cement, and fertilizer, thus encouraging these companies to keep polluting, not to decarbonize.
Subsidizing pollution
During a climate crisis,
Just doesn't make sense.
without that subsidy to keep polluting, more heavy industries would be encouraged to make these changes, and the government would have funds to ensure a just transition for their workers.
Now is the time to make sure everyone pays a fair price for climate pollution.
Let's call on the Minister for Climate Change to end free carbon credits and put in place protections to decarbonize these industries in a way that is fast and fair.
There is an opportunity right now to have our say on the government's draft plan for climate action up to 2030.
This is the crucial window when we can phase out free carbon credits.
Make a submission today, calling on the government to stop subsidising pollution. Go to the link below to use our submission guide.
Kia ora.
Hopefully that just gives you a bit of an overview of the campaign and the issue that we're focusing on. I'll briefly speak a bit more to the core background to the campaign, and I guess we're coming at the submission process not in isolation. So this campaign's been going for about a year. We gathered 6,000 petition signatures, which we handed in to Parliament a couple of months ago. We've gained support from opposition MPs, and we've gained attention in the media to this issue. And the submission opportunity is really a moment to land this policy area as a key issue for the government to tackle if it wants to take climate action seriously. So the submission process comes in the context of that broader campaign. And the campaign is calling for an end to free carbon credits, which we believe can cut pollution and also unlock green jobs in some key industrial sectors in Aotearoa. I'll just make this full screen. So the context is that we have a few large businesses in Aotearoa that receive free carbon credits to subsidize their pollution, which is holding them back from decarbonising. And just 5 of these businesses that receive 3/4 of all the free carbon credits, they have a pollution footprint equivalent to almost half of the vehicle fleet in Aotearoa. So if you imagine all the effort we're putting into trying to switch to electric vehicles or reduce our car use, just these 5 companies have the same footprint as half of the nation's vehicle fleet. So if we can shift and help decarbonize some of these big industrial polluters that are currently subsidized to pollute, then we can make a really big impact. And that's why our campaign's focusing in on this issue. The good news is that change is possible, and that's something that we want to encourage and share with people when inviting them to make a submission. The example of New Zealand Steel that was referenced in that video, where we have one industrial process that has changed, has taken, or it will take, around the equivalent of around 300,000 petrol cars off the road forever. And so if we can get more of these big industrial processes decarbonized, that makes a really big impact. So why, kind of some bottom lines of why we think this matters is that it's an expensive policy to maintain currently. This handout of free carbon credits is equivalent to $500 million or so each year in lost revenue. It's incompatible with our climate goals. We will still be subsidizing these polluters in 2050 when the Zero Carbon Act is meant to have us at net zero. The free credits were originally meant to be gone by 2030, but they just kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. It's unfair because households are carrying the burden of action by paying a full carbon price, while these large industries, mostly multinational companies, are not. And we don't think it's good long-term planning when other countries are taking steps to decarbonize and end free carbon credits like the European Union. So coming to the context now of this submission opportunity, the government's emissions reduction plan draft that they put out for consultation actually admitted that free carbon credits to big polluters are undermining the chances of meeting our long-term climate targets, but the plan currently doesn't propose to change the status quo. So they're recognizing it's a problem, but they haven't got the policy solutions in this plan to try and do something about it. That's where we come in to try and get a plan inserted, a plan to end free carbon credits inserted into this emissions reduction plan. So if enough of us call for a plan to end free carbon credits to be added in through the submission process, we can solidify this issue as a key climate policy that the government can't ignore. So that's the context for the campaign and the issue. We're now going to switch focus to talking about how do we gather submissions? What are the resources that we've prepared to help you do that? So I'm going to walk through the different resources shortly, but I just want to highlight some of the key steps to kind of get us there. So the submission process is open until the 21st of August. And if you're in a church context, that gives us 2 Sundays when we can mobilize submissions. That's this Sunday, the 11th, and next Sunday, the 18th. And so the steps that we suggest doing, obviously, each context is different and you'll go about it in the way that is appropriate for your context. But the steps that we suggest doing are to try and get notice in advance about the why, the what, and the how of gathering submissions in your context. So trying to get a notice put in the weekly church bulletin you might have, so that people are aware when they're coming in on Sunday, or they're coming into the meeting, that this is going to be talked about. The next step is preparing the submission materials and the technology. So that'll require some printing of resources. So we have paper submission forms, as well as some fact sheets that you might want to print off. Paper we find is probably the easiest, lowest bar of entry for people to just write a few sentences on a paper submission form that you can then process. So that'll require some printing as well as some stationery. We have an online quick submission form, so potentially having a couple of devices available that people can do that on, or people can do it on their own devices or phone. So you'll want to think about internet access. Then there's how you want to pitch it to people in the church service or the meeting. So whether you want to show some slides as part of the service or at the end of it, whether you want to show that 2-minute video that we watched. So just preparing the necessary technology. Then in the day, at the opportunity when you're trying to introduce the issue, that's when we're going to introduce the why, the what, and the how. And we've got some resources to do that. So we have the video, we have a slideshow prepared that you could show, we have a kind of little script that you could read out if you want to just introduce it verbally, and we have a 2-page explainer as well that helps give some more context for people. In terms of the how, that's really up to you as to how you want to do this within the service. So some examples are if you want to include it as part of the service itself. After the service, as part of a morning tea, you might have a station set up and you flagged it during the service, and then actually gathering people to try get them to the tables where the submission forms are. Or you might have a dedicated meeting and gathering of people afterwards, or at another time that you're trying to arrange. So the how is really up to you, but you want to think about what best suits your context and what is actually going to get people to follow through. We would try and recommend that you physically when people are in the same space actually gather the submissions rather than just put a notice out and hope that people follow through and do it in their own time. We do find that the return rate on submissions is much higher if you're doing it in the moment and actually helping people to follow through rather than just leaving it up to them to do in their own time. But obviously that's up to you as to what you can enable. So then step 4 is actually the gathering submissions. And then the last step, which is key, is actually getting them sent in to us before the deadline. So we are sort of acting as a conduit. Common Grace Aotearoa, that's we are acting as a conduit to the Ministry for the Environment. The consultation is being run by the ministry, but they have a very large discussion document, and their consultation has over 60 questions that they're asking. What we've done is we've distilled of those 60 questions, what are the either 3 or 6 key questions that we want to focus in on, and we've prepared a submission guide for that. And so we've matched those questions. We're hoping that those will be treated as individual submissions because they match, and we're in liaison with the Ministry for the Environment. They know that we're going to be sending them a bunch of online forms as well as a bunch of scanned paper copies. So people need to be aware that the submissions will come to us and then we'll pass them on to the Ministry for the Environment. They also need to be aware that when they make a submission, that those they're not their personal details, but the content of the submissions might be made publicly available. For example, if someone did an Official Information Act request, then the content of the submissions might be made publicly available. But no personal details will be shared, and we also, as Common Grace Aotearoa, the data, none of that data will be shared other than the data that is required by the Ministry for the Environment. So that that's the key content that's on the form itself, such as name, email, and some background demographic data. That information is a required question. That's why we ask it. We haven't asked any more data that is than what is required by the ministry, and we commit to safe storage and use of any data that it's gathered. So that's the key steps. Yeah, I'm sure that there'll be questions that come up from that, and we'll kind of just workshop that a bit when we get to the questions time. But I want to walk through what is in the toolkit that we've prepared and the different resources. So I've spoken to some of this already, but we have some template notices that you could put in your church newsletter or email, a script that could be read out. There's some optional slides that you could show, and or the 2-minute video that we've watched earlier. two-page explainer on the campaign and the submission opportunity. That's something that might be good to print, which just helps to give context. If people are coming to this and they have no background as to the Don't Subsidize Pollution campaign and no background as to what the emissions reduction plan is all about, that two-pager just gives them a bit of context to each of those things. There's a one-page fact sheet that has some key facts if they want some extra information to include when writing their submission. We have a kids submission template. Now this is the kids template is a chance for creative drawing or writing, or a prayer could be written on there. It's the chance to get creative, and you may want to incorporate that into your service in some way. Just noting that type of submission will be treated differently to the submissions that actually match the questions in the ministry's consultation. But we know that these kids submissions and creative submissions are actually really powerful. During the Zero Carbon Act process, some of these kids submissions were actually put up on the walls of the Ministry for the Environment office because they were so powerful in affirming the work that the ministry was doing. So we still think it's super valuable to involve kids in the process, or to involve creative expressions of submissions, not just the answering the set questions, but just to note that they will be treated differently. Then we have two options for people to make submissions using our template. The paper form is bare bones 3 questions that we've tried to keep as minimal as possible. The online form is 6 questions, so slightly longer, but still a lot less than the 61 that the ministry's asked. So there's 2 options there for adults to engage with. So I'll now just go and show you, while my screen is shared, show you what these different resources look like. The key kind of information hub for you to look at is the endfreecredits.nz website. When you type in endfreecredits.nz and go to the Take Action page, scroll down and there is the full list and links to all these resources here. So we have links to the notice templates, the paper submission form, the explainer, the online submission form, the kids submission form, the video and the slides, etc. And then there is a button to the full resource pack. When you click the full resource pack, that will take you to this Google Drive folder, which has all the resources you can download and print. So just to start with, we have the slides that you could show. This is if you find it helpful to have something to speak to give more context for the campaign. And these slides are similar to what I showed earlier on in this meeting. So we have the video linked in there in the slides that you can prepare the audio for in your meeting. The introduction to why submitting at this moment is important. What we're calling for is a climate plan that stops subsidizing pollution. These are the key asks of our campaign. Those slides that I showed before about the facts about these top 5 recipients of free carbon credits have a massive footprint. Change is possible if, like we get more examples like the New Zealand steel transformation, some key bullet points about why it matters. And then we have this slide, which has a QR code as well as the link. And if people scan that on their phone, that'll get taken straight to the online submission form, the 6 questions that we've prepared. So that's the slides. That's if it's helpful to do that. I'll now go to what the submission forms look like, starting with the paper form. So the paper form that you can print off a range of copies of looks like this. It's got a front page which just gathers the key data, name, email, region, and this question here, the ministry is asking like what groups people are associated with. They didn't have a none option in their form, but feel free to just encourage people to write none if they don't have a direct association. But obviously, if they're a part of a church, that would count as a community group, or yeah, they might like to declare an association, or they might not. We do require those 4 data questions: the name, which is a full name, email, what region you're in, and are you also associated with any of the following. So please try and get people to fill in that information. We've also put if there's a particular church, and that's just for our purposes, so we know roughly, where submissions are coming in from. That's the first page. It's also got the link to the online form there, and the link to the ministry's full submission opportunity there as well. Page 2 is a few key questions to answer, and we've split it into 2 columns. The left-hand column is where people write their answer, and the right-hand column is some suggested content, which we would encourage at the end of the process. You could cut off that column so that it isn't super obvious that we're just we're guiding what people on what to say. The first question: what do you think is working well in New Zealand to reduce our emissions and achieve the 2050 net zero target? This is an opportunity for people to share what they've been doing in their own lives to take action on climate change and reduce their carbon footprint, what they've been trying to do, but what they would like to see more of. For example, our church has been composting our food scraps, been good to have locally accessible funding for community compost initiatives, for example. I'd like to see more initiatives that help everyday people and local communities to reduce our emissions. So it's kind of a general question. It's not actually specific to our campaign, but it's a chance for people to engage in what they're doing in their own life and what they'd like to see more of. The second question: what, if any, other sectors or areas do you think have significant opportunities for cost-effective emissions reduction? This is where we bring in the campaign, where we are trying to highlight that some industries are not pulling their weight, and ending free carbon credits is a big opportunity to actually get more emissions reduction than we're currently getting. So at the very least, the kind of barest bones of submissions from folks in your churches would be: I'm trying to take climate action in my own life. I want big industries to be doing the same. Please end free carbon credits. Right? That's the kind of barest bones, and that would be answering those first 2 questions. And that's a really valuable contribution. If it's just, I'm trying to do my best, I want these industries to pull their weight, stop subsidizing pollution, end free carbon credits. That would be if we got hundreds of people saying that, that's a really powerful contribution. And it's great if people can go into more detail than that. But that's still a really good engagement with this process. So that second question is a chance to bring in the reality that some industries don't face a price on pollution because the government gives them free carbon credits. And it's also, if people are passionate about other areas like transport or waste, it's a chance for them to talk about other areas they see opportunities to take more action in. So, for example, while I'd like to cycle to work, I am currently limited by the lack of bike lanes. It would be good to see more investment in cycling infrastructure, is one example. So that's the first page of questions. The last page is: do you agree that the government should continue to use the emissions trading scheme as a key tool to encourage emissions reductions, stay within budgets, and achieve the 2050 target? And it's just 3 options. Circle which one resonates with you, and we suggest circling agree here. Then lastly, please provide any additional feedback on the government's thinking about how to use the New Zealand emissions trading scheme to reduce emissions. And this is where we have suggested highlighting the key asks of our campaign. If it was one sentence, it would be that ending free carbon credits by 2030 needs to be a key part of this plan. One sentence, fairly easy to do. But then we list the 4 key policy asks of our campaign. So they are fully phasing out free carbon credits by 2030, co-investing in the upfront costs for decarbonising highly polluting industries where appropriate, following the steps of the European Union to introduce what's called a carbon border mechanism to protect industries as they face the full carbon price, and funding just transition plans and involving workers where decarbonisation options aren't available. So those 4 things we don't expect heaps of people to have to want to write out, but if they're the kind of core policy arcs of our campaign. If it was but just to emphasize, if it was just one sentence that they've got a time and bandwidth to do, it would be the sentence that ending free carbon credits by 2030 needs to be a key part of the emissions reduction plan. And that's it for the paper form. I'll show you, I won't go fully through the online form, but I'll show you what it looks like. So it's this is the link in it. This is what it brings up. It has those same questions as the paper form. It's got a bit of an explainer on the left-hand side and then the form on the right-hand side. The same questions as the other one. There are just a couple of more extra ones, which are, again, we have some suggested content for that people can choose whether or not they want to adapt. The suggested content, it's always best when people use their own words. We put this here to guide people, and in reality, many people just copy and paste. That's okay, but it is best if people can personalize it to their own story, why it matters to them, and putting these types of ideas that we suggest in their own words. That really helps to make these submissions personal and for the weight of what they're saying to get carried across to officials. So when people submit here online, that's submitting that data will be held by Common Grace, and then we will pass that on in spreadsheet format, the answers, to the Ministry for the Environment. So yeah, that's the online form there. There's a disclaimer about that by taking that action, people are agreeing to hear from us about this campaign and our other issues that we work on, but they can unsubscribe at any time. So that's the online form. The other resources in the resource pack, as I mentioned before, is just a sample script. More suggestions on how you could organize a submission writing event in a church context. Fact sheets to help people with writing their submissions. I'll bring up the kids template. This is what the kids template looks like. So we're inviting kids to, or anyone, to draw a picture or write their ideas in the box. Box says, "Kia ora, my name is X. In 2050, which is when the Zero Carbon Act requires us to be at net zero emissions, I'll be X years old. I don't want Aotearoa to still be subsidizing polluters in 2050. Instead, I want a climate plan that creates good green jobs and clean energy. These are my ideas for what we can do in the next 5 years." So they might like to draw wind turbines or solar panels or trees. They might like to write their ideas of what that is, more bike lanes, etc. There's a few suggested sentences there at the top. More bike lanes, buses and trains. Make big factories do their fair share of action. Help workers to transition to green jobs. Again, that's kind of anything goes. With the paper form and these kids forms, at the bottom of the page are details of how to send them into me to gather them. And so that can be through taking a photo. So once you've got the submissions in, you've gathered in the paper forms after the Sunday service, and then by the 20th of August, which is a day before the consultation closes, it'd be great to have those in the day before, so I've got time to collate and organize them all before I send them in. Taking a photo of each submission or scanning them if you've got a scanner and sending them to my email there. So that's the kids form. Getting back to, so that's pretty much in the terms of the resources pack. The only other one I'll draw your attention to is this background info. This first page is just a kind of introduction to the campaign, a bit like the video. And then the second page is some context as to why churches are doing this and why it's important for churches to speak up at this time. So if that's helpful, that resource is there. And that brings us back to the steps in the process. I'll just I'll check in on any questions in the chat here. Yeah, so I'll just try and answer those two questions in the chat before moving on. So removing free carbon credit. Question from Chris: how did you identify that removing free carbon credits was a point that the government may move on? We chose this campaign area because we thought before the election, either side of the spectrum, the emissions trading scheme is seen as a key tool to reduce emissions. But that's particularly the case under this government. They are almost relying exclusively on the emissions trading scheme to meet our climate targets. Free carbon credits is one of the things that is holding the emissions trading scheme back from doing its job properly. So particularly for a national-led government, if they want the ETS to do the bulk of the work, this has got to be a problem that they need to address. We also think it is an issue they might move on because they have expressed they don't like subsidizing businesses and the idea of corporate welfare. And we tried to flip that on its head and say subsidizing these businesses to pollute is corporate welfare, and that might be a line that resonates with them. And lastly, there's examples of cross-party consensus on the issue of these free carbon credits needing to be addressed. Last year, at the Environment Select Committee, National Labour and the Greens all unanimously agreed to reform the free carbon credit system to tackle over allocation of free credits, where industries were being given far above 100% of their emissions worth of free carbon credits, and they tackled that issue well together. And so there was an example of cross-party work there, which we think we want to kind of encourage again to actually tackle the deeper structural issue of the existence of these free carbon credits in the first place. So I hope that answers your question, Chris. Question from Irene around using the just transition terminology, which was a terminology that the Labour-led government was using, and potential way of reframing that under this government. I think that's a good point. We want to have in there somewhere around that workers need to be supported in the transition, and that's using just transition language as a way of kind of summarizing a set of ideas relatively simply. Yeah, I think whether it's a just transition or an equitable transition or ensuring that workers are looked after, there's lots of ways of talking about it. But we think that is a key part of this campaign and what we're trying to call for. Obviously, there might be people who don't want to talk about this issue in making their submission, and that's completely fine as well. If people are having their say, whether they're amplifying the asks of this campaign or not, that's better than them not saying anything. So we are aware that not everyone will be fully on board with what our campaign's calling for, and that's okay. So just zooming back to the steps in the process to gather submissions. We'll go back into the slides here. So those are the materials that we've worked through, and again, the key hub for all those resources is that endfreecredits.nz / go to the take action page. That's where you'll find links to all the resources and links to that Google Drive folder that has all of them there as well. I think it's important to think about how you're going to introduce this issue. If the complexity of this campaign feels overwhelming, it's a harder ask than just saying we want more climate action. But I just want to kind of encourage you with that at its barest bones, it is about we don't want to be subsidizing pollution during a climate crisis. If people can write one sentence about how we don't want to subsidize big polluters to keep polluting, please do something about that in this plan. If it comes down to that at its core, that is super valuable, getting hundreds of people to say that, and keeping it on the radar, making it a key area that the government needs to address. So if you're worried about the issue feeling overwhelming or overly complex for your people in your networks and churches, just really try and distill it down. And then for those that do have more bandwidth to engage in the complexity of it, the online form has those 6 questions with a bit more detail of suggested content, and there are links to resources that go into a lot more detail. But the paper form, which has 3 questions and it has a couple of those key sentences to really hit home, would be the way to go for most people who are going to engage in this process. So I will stop talking there and hand over to John Luke, who's just going to share about his own experience of doing this in the past and what has worked well and what he's learned about it, around that key step of how to actually make it work in the moment. You've done the notice, you've prepped people, but are they going to follow through and do it? So over to you, John Luke.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So yeah, we've done this a few times with different campaigns over the years, kind of going around churches and asking people to submit and collecting submissions on the day. So this is kind of just sharing a little bit about how that's gone for us in the past and some of the things we've learned. And it's really recapping what Alex has just shared, but trying to exemplify that by how it's worked in the past. So you'll see on the slides here on the left, we've got Tessa here giving the notice in the first instance, that we'll be collecting submissions after the service. Alex has talked through the resources and the tools and things we've given you to do that, so I won't go over that again. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that we found that people are really keen to be involved in these things. So often our people in our churches or our organizations are just really yearning to take action, but often just don't really know how. So I guess 2 things there. First of all is, I guess, don't be shy or scared about kind of fronting up to your people in your congregation and feeling like you're trying to twist their arm to get them to do something, because invariably people are really keen to be involved and really want to take action, and this is a really good way of doing it. So be confident in that, I think. And the second thing, of course, is you want to be telling people how important it is to have their say, and also how easy and simple it will be. And yeah, the resources we've given you hopefully will be a good way to get people to do it as painlessly as possible, because it is fairly straightforward at the end of the day. So to give your notice, obviously, you need to have everything lined up, and we've given you all the resources. But coordinating with the vicar, the person who's leading the service or whatever, is really important. And just making sure everything's prepped on the day. So then after the service, what we've tried to do in the past is sort of make ourselves as visible as possible. So if people are congregating for their morning tea, or where they will like kind of walk out of the church, that's where we've tried to set up our tables with all our submission guide stuff on, so people really can't miss us, to be as visible as possible right at that moment. And this requires you to be a little bit out, bring yourself forward and inviting people to submit and be there and be seen and be heard. So really encourage you to do that. Alex, if you just move on to this next slide. So here's a couple of sort of tables we've set up in the past for different things to get submissions. So you'll see there on the right, we've got a computer set up for people to do the online submitting, probably hotspotting from phones there. And then on the left, we've got the paper forms ready to go. And what you want to be doing is just be there, be available, just to inviting people to submit, and then being there to coach them through that. Like I said before, I think there's a high chance that some of the people will perhaps be a little bit intimidated by kind of submitting in a formal government process, which isn't something we do every day, and it might be a first time. So being there to make the process seem as simple, as easy as possible, and to answer silly questions is really important. So it requires you to be familiar with all the submission materials that we've provided, and the couple of guides there, the online one and the paper guide, and what that looks like. And then also having in your back pocket the kind of silly questions or concerns that people might have. So things like, who will read my submission? Will my name be publicly available? What's this all about, really? Understanding how the emissions reduction plan fits in and what the government's doing. And we can talk a bit about that later on when we answer some questions. But just having in your back pocket kind of answers to some questions and concerns people might have, we found is important. Another thing which Alex has touched on before is I don't be concerned or scared about people doing quite wacky submissions. And what I mean by that is people who are drawing pictures or writing poetry or that kind of thing. It was a really heartwarming story that when we learned after the Zero Carbon campaign, that in the staff tea room at the Ministry of Environment, they put on the walls and the table a whole bunch of pictures that kids had done and this big newsprint that people had done. So even if it looks in the moment like people are not generating anything that might be useful for like a submission process, don't worry about that, because it will hopefully have some impact at some level, and maybe some ways that we can't foresee. Then just lastly, what we found as well is that some people will be interested and say, "Oh, can I take this home? Can I take this material home and do it at home?" And at that point, you say, "I really encourage you to do it right here, right now, in the moment," because the danger is, of course, people will go home and then not do it and forget about it. And I know I've been guilty of doing that in the past. So really want to stress, if you can, getting people to do it right then and right there, either sending it on the online submission and clicking send, or giving you the hard copy form that they submit so you can give it to Alex. Really important to try and get it locked in on the day in that moment, rather than people going home to do it. But yeah, just to recap all of that, and the kind of the key point that I want to make is that we just found that people are tremendously engaged in these things and want to do something and want to be involved and want to submit and want to have their say. And this is democracy in action, and it's just a really, really helpful thing that we can do to let people have their voice. And it's an important campaign as well, and an important thing to be saying to the government as they plan the next 5 years of their emissions reduction plan. We've had a great time doing it, and it's been really, really impactful and important. And I just hope that we can keep this tradition within our churches, that we have our say and we tell the government what's important. Yeah, so that's me.
So thanks so much, JL, for that. And yeah, that brings us to a time for questions. And we might go a little bit beyond 8:30. If you do need to shoot off at that point, feel free to, but we'll just give it maybe 10 minutes space for questions and chatting through queries that people may have. So feel free to just unmute yourself and ask any questions you've got.
I do have a question. Do we know how feasible it is? Like,
Feasible
is this a
the
feasible
campaign.
ask? Is feasible ask from to end the subsidy?
Yeah, so great question. So yeah, we've tried to make it as feasible as possible in terms of drawing on referring back to how it was done, something that was originally intended when the emissions trading scheme was set up, that these credits would be gone by 2030. And that's what we're asking the government to do now, is just return to the original timeframe. Feasibility, we can refer to the fact that the European Union is doing this. So there's an example of a major jurisdiction that is transitioning the subsidy for these industries, phasing them out, and instead switching into something called a carbon border mechanism, which is an alternative way where those industries do have to pay the full carbon price, but their transition is managed. So we can refer to the example of the EU to show feasibility. And then lastly, it's a policy that we've got support so far from the Greens and Labour on broadly, that not all the details, but the broad kind of emphasis of it. And so that's through the traction of the campaign starting over the last 8 months, we've secured support of the opposition parties. And so if we can kind of keep building momentum and putting it as increasing the profile of it, then we think we can eventually get the government over the line. Chris, you got your...
Yeah, you're asking that question about the feasibility. Well, the government withdrew the Giddy Fund, which was about $650 million. And so effectively they've pulled that money from the subsidization of corporates. And so, you know, they're quite happy to withdraw that and put the cost back onto corporates or industrial polluters in that sense. And so, you know, they've already taken half a step down that road.
Yeah, so the that fund that they have cut back on, yeah, that led to the New Zealand Steel example of New Zealand Steel deciding to decarbonize that process because they had co-investment from the government. We're saying in the campaign broadly that type of co-investment is sometimes necessary to help those industries make those big industrial switches, where they have to make a big upfront investment to change a industrial process. But we're saying rather than a grant format, that should ideally be a loan format. So it should be conditional.
Then that follows the supercharging EV fund, which is $90 million, which has been giving out as loans.
Yeah, so so I guess there's, whether it's a loan or whether it's a grant, that we see some role for that co-investment, because if sort of paired with the taking off the band-aid of the free carbon credits, without some sort of support, some of the industries the shock might lead to them shutting down, or the shock of the transition. So it's about how to help manage that transition as they lose their free carbon credits. How do we support them to decarbonize? For example, the New Zealand Steel example is we want a domestic steel producer to stay around, and we need steel to build railways and public housing, and we need steel to build the green transition. And so how do we support them to decarbonize to make zero carbon steel? And so we don't want to be subsidizing their current business as usual, but how do we enable that transition? And so that's where we have that kind of combination of things in the 4 asks of the campaign. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, either about the content of the campaign or the process and the resources.
If we wanted to do the full 66 length question thing, or at least have it for reference, then where would we find that?
Yeah, so there's a link to it on the paper, the paper form document, the link to the government consultation, or if you just type in Ministry for the Environment Emissions Reduction Plan, it'll come up in a Google search there fairly easily.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I was just thinking that obviously this is a particular area of trying to get rid of free carbon credits, but there's also other groups I know of that have different emphases that, like, where I could also see that drawing their attention to certain things might like really engage them to do those questions.
Totally, yeah. And it's a really good point, Chris. So yeah, there's other organizations that have put out a submission guide, like Climate Club, and we've collaborated a bit with them so that our key asks are in their submission guide. We've also shared with other kind of climate NGOs key points to include in their submissions. So yeah, we try to want that to go far and wide and want people to speak to the other areas that they're passionate about as well. Great. Last chance for any questions before we hand back to Uni to wrap up.
And just once
Go
again, just to make sure that I understood correctly. So once in the scanned submissions of the paper form online, but to raise. So what would be the personal data that you do keep and for how long? And what are the personal data that go to the ministry? Sorry, it's my first time.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So of the paper forms, we'll just scan them, combine them into one large PDF once they're all scanned and gathered in, and send them into the ministry. We'll keep a track of the number of forms and where they came from in terms of church congregations and things, just for our own kind of keeping tabs of things. The online, but we don't intend to keep that data as a it would just be a lot of data entry to manually type in that data. The online form, that data is added into our general database, and people will be initially subscribed into hearing more about this campaign, because we want to kind of update people and keep them involved once they've taken this action. But they can unsubscribe from that at any point. So if they do the online version, there's a disclaimer there at the bottom. But that's, yeah, as soon as they're unsubscribed, then that takes them out of our system. In terms of the information that's handed over to the ministry, both the paper form and the online form only collects the core data that is required. The only question that we've added in is just on the online form, indicating whether people were directed to the online form via the Anglican Diocese of Wellington or the Anglican Diocese of Auckland, just so that for both of those dioceses who are involved in this, they can get a sense of how many people made a submission via through their rallying people to submit. So that's the only question we've added that's not mirrored from the consultation as extra data. Great, I'll just check the chat that there's no more questions. Cool. Thanks everyone for your attention and for for listening, and hope that was useful, and I'll hand back to Uni for closing the meeting.
Yes, thank you so much everyone for coming. We appreciate it. And thank you Alex and JL for your knowledge. So, aku mihi ano kia tato e hui hui mai nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Acknowledgements and thanks to everyone gathered here. We'll end with the karakia. Kia hora te marino. Kia whakapapa ponamu te moana. He huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Huie taekie. Have a great evening.
Thank you all for your help in putting this together.
Thanks everyone, good luck, and feel free to get in touch if you have more questions.